Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today is Tuesday, January 12th, 2021. Happy New Year's to all. You are here for the 2019 California Building Standards Code Intervening Code Cycle Updates. This is part one of a two-part series, which today we'll be covering a bit of an introduction to the intervening code cycle. We'll also be covering the California Administrative Code and the California Building Code. You are approximately here for a 1 hour presentation with a question and answer portion at the end of the presentation. We've also provided you a handout of this presentation, which you can access if you go to the uh, software portion or that toolbox under handouts. You'll be able to download a PDF copy of the presentation. Please know that you will all be muted during the presentation. And if you have a question about the presentation itself, please go ahead and type the question into the question box in that GoTo software toolbox as well. Please keep your questions generic for today, but if you have a specific question related to a specific project, please feel free to email us at regsunit@oshpod.ca.gov. Again, that's regsunit@oshpod.ca.gov. If you do experience transmission difficulties during the presentation, please log out, log back in using the same link that the GoTo software sent you, and we will do the same if we experience any transmission difficulties on our end as well. Today, for presenters, we have Mr. Richard Tannehill, Senior Architect and BSU Supervisor, or the Building Standards Unit Supervisor, and Mr. Roy Lobo, Principal Structural Engineer for the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development. Richard, I hand the mic over to you. If you can please go ahead and begin.
Thank you, Caesar. Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about, I'm trying to get rid of that little menu on there, the new intervening building code that'll be coming out. It's actually in print now, but it won't be taking effect until July of later this year. So you have time to review it and see what the implications are. But we're going to go over the basics of it. Some of the items I'll go over pretty quickly because there's a lot of pointer changes or just corrections of wording, and shouldn't take a whole lot at that point. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is a two-part series. Today we're going to be covering part one, the administrative code, as well as part two, the building code for both volume one and volume two, which will be the non-structural and the planning, as well as volume two, the structural. And we have Roy Lobo with us today as well for that portion. And then in February, we're doing the electrical, mechanical, and plumbing code, as well as the existing building code. So kind of some basics today. We tried to color coordinate what's changing. So bold text or regular black text is existing and there's no change. Underlined blue text is what we're adding to the code. And if it's underlined blue with a red wording there, that's just for emphasis. And also, if it's gray and struck out, that's the old language, sometimes useful to see what it used to say. And any purple text is just for reference. We might be talking about something and pull in a definition. So that's just for reference only. Okay. So let's start with part one, administrative code. And there's a little bit of a lag on here, so just bear with us on the change of the slides. First thing we're looking at is the requirements for SPC. What we're doing is removing the language for submitting an application for an extension, because that date has expired and is as of January 1st, 2020. And so just the wording is changed so that if it was in progress, this is what you do. So it's just really a change in tense here. We've added some definitions. We're going to go over those. We added emergency repair, which is a repair to or replacement of an element of a building structure, utility system, or equipment that is essential to the continued safe occupation and operation of a facility. It may include repairs needed after disaster. This is going to be used when, if there is something that you consider an emergency repair, you would contact the regional compliance officer or RCO or the compliance officer and let them know you have an emergency repair, and they can authorize that to be done. We also added, trying to clarify the definition for a hospital building, if it's freestanding. It used to be if a building is separated from a hospital building. Now it's just a freestanding building, and if you remember from the 1R presentations, a freestanding building is physically not connected to the hospital. It is separated, as it said before, but there's going to be a lot more use of the word freestanding in this code with some of the definitions, so that's why we revised that. And this is really to accommodate some of the 1R implications as well as jurisdictional effects of a freestanding building. Other definitions we added was maintenance. We talked about emergency repair. Now, maintenance is the routinely recurring work required to keep a facility in such condition that it may be continuously utilized at its original or design capacity and efficiency for its intended purpose. Actions necessary for retaining or restoring an existing element of a component or building or a specific operable condition to achieve its maximum useful life, including corrective maintenance and preventative maintenance. So basically, you can do repairs to your facility under the maintenance requirement. And again, this falls into some of the definitions of when you need a permit. Substantial compliance is a term you might have heard OSHPD using over the last year or two. It's basically very similar to a certificate of occupancy or substantial completion. Substantial completion actually has a different legal term and is used in a different context. So we've added the definition of substantial compliance to show that a stage of construction of a building or project or a designated portion of the project that is sufficiently complete in accordance with the approved construction plans and the California Building Standards Code, that the owner may occupy the building for its designated and intended purpose. So this allows for partial occupancies as well as complete occupancies. The difference between a substantial compliance and a certificate of occupancy is if you have a brand new building that's never been occupied, or if you're changing the occupancy of a building or a project or an area department, that would be a certificate of occupancy. If you're just doing an alteration to the building, it would be a substantial compliance. Okay, moving on. This is basically adding some language that says you can submit plans electronically. Before it talked about plans having to be a certain size and weight, and just saying that these can also be submitted electronically. The Building Energy Efficiency Program, as you know, started with the 2019 Building Code, and we had a bunch of requirements in there for HVAC systems, indoor lighting, water heating, and building envelope. And it actually really doesn't even apply to alterations. So what we're doing instead is we're just pointing over to the Energy Code, and we have to comply with the requirements that they provide, because this did conflict with what was in the Energy Code. So we're just making that clarification and pointing back to what are the requirements of the Energy Code. And under the Energy Code, the alterations for licensed healthcare facilities are exempt. This is new language we're adding. If you're doing plan review and you have changes in the scope during plan review, after the plan review has already been started, shall be be required to be submitted as a separate project. That's actually always been the case. It's just never been stated clearly. But what we're doing is adding an exception that at the discretion of the office, which is OSHPD, changes in the scope may be allowed to the original project, but it'll be done as an examination. And basically it's time and materials for that review. We get a lot of projects that they change the whole scope. We've already did most of the review, and we have to go back, redo it all over again. So that will be a time and material change. I'm just adding some language here for fees. If you do a preliminary review, that fee is non-refundable. The work for that review has already been completed and the effort has already been expended, so the fee cannot be refunded. And that is still 10% of the original or the total fee, but it is still deducted from the final fee. But if that effort is made, that portion of the fee, that 10%, is non-refundable. If you're doing a phased submittal review or a collaborative review, a 10% fee is required up front for those types of reviews. That also will be non-refundable because the effort has already been made. If the project is canceled, the effort and the review has already started. OSHPD has already put a lot of time into these projects, and if the project is canceled, that fee is to cover our costs. And same with the collaborative review, it's a 1.9% fee for that. That, again, just 10%. These are phased plan review and collaborative review. This is just the difference in the percentage, and the 10% is non-refundable. If you are requesting a refund, we are actually changing one that occurs, so the owners can actually get their refund earlier. It previously used to state that is 1 year from the date the project is closed. If you've done much hospital work, you know that may get stretched out quite a ways. So now it is 1 year from the date of certificate of occupancy or certificate of substantial compliance issue date. So that, again, it brings that date that the owner can get the refund a lot closer. And we're just changing some grammatical stuff here as well. This section is similar to what we said during plan review. If you make major scope changes, that has to be submitted as a new project. This is for ACDs, or amended construction documents. If there is a major scope change in an ACD, as coming in as an ACD, that's going to substantially change the scope of the project, it will be required to be submitted as a separate project. Again, this is old code language that was already there, but what we're basically doing, we're giving the option, the option of reviewing that as an ACD, but it will be done as a time and material examination type project. For the IOR Class B inspector exam, there's just some clarification on the requirements that are needed to meet the minimum qualifications to be a Class B inspector. And that's basically adding the high school graduation or equivalent, 2 years experience involving building types of type 1 or 2 construction as an architects, engineers, owners, local building official or general contractors representative in technical inspection or major structural, non-structural system of components of the building, and possession of the valid certificate of all the following categories, and those have not changed. Basically, it's adding this 2-year experience in the high school graduation that was mistakenly left off previously. So that's it for part 1. We're going to jump over to part 2, the building code, and we are going to cover volumes 1 and 2 today. So at the very beginning, we're just changing the application of an OSHPD 1 building or a 1R building to include, it used to say non-conforming hospital building. We're including a non-conforming hospital SBC or freestanding. And this is the reason we added that freestanding definition, because a hospital building can be a freestanding building if it's removed from acute care service and stays under OSHPD jurisdiction for any reason. So we're just clarifying that definition. Shouldn't affect too many of you. For earthquake monitoring instruments, this is just something that we're adding some language here, that the maintenance and service of the instruments shall be in accordance with Appendix L of Part 2, Volume 2 of the Building Code. Just clarifying the language there. So we're having a little bit of a lag in these changing, so I apologize for that. Okay, under definitions here, let me back up one. That's what always happens. You hit it twice and it doesn't do it and then jumps two ahead. Right now under the equipment definition of fixed equipment, movable and mobile equipment, OSHPD had a banner. We are removing the banner from this. This would apply to OSHPD 3 buildings and anything that's non-OSHPD. But what we are doing is adding new definitions that are very similar but expanded on for equipment. And this is applied to the OSHPD 1, 2, 4, and 5. Note that it does not apply to a 1R or an OSHPD 3 building. Basically, what we're adding is different types of equipment to help really clarify the requirements of when anchorage is required and what type of anchorage is required and what needs to be shown on the drawings. So first we have countertop equipment, which is equipment that typically remains on a countertop, workbench, shelf, or support other than floor during its service life. This can or may not be fixed to that countertop, and that'll be covered later. Essential equipment means equipment that the failure of which will significantly impair the operations during or after a disaster. The facility needs to identify which equipment is essential when they're doing the project. In addition to that, if they basically say nothing's essential, anything that's required to support the 8 basic services of a hospital also are by default considered essential. A fixed equipment means equipment that is directly attached to the building or directly connected to a service distribution system utility. Interim equipment means that is used greater than 180 days during construction. As you might be familiar with a temporary equipment being under 180 days. So interim, we get a lot of comments that we have to build out a full central plant because they can't use the generator longer than 180 days, and that's not the case. It just becomes interim, and the anchorage is based on the building code, and you don't take the benefits of the temporary can. Mobile equipment means equipment with or without wheels or rollers that is typically used in a different location than where it is stored and moved from one location in the building to another during ordinary use. Key word here is ordinary use. If it's moving around like a workstation on wheels or something like that, is considered mobile equipment. In addition to that, we have movable equipment, which is equipment that is directly attached to a building and or directly connected to a service distribution system or utility with or without wheels. It may have wheels on it, that is typically remains in one fixed location during its service life or use, but is required to be periodically moved to facilitate cleaning or maintenance. This would be like a Pyxis machine. They're on wheels, they're secured to an area, but they do have to be unsecured and moved out of the way for cleaning and then put back in its original place. Other equipment means equipment that is not directly connected to a building service distribution system that may or may not have wheels and is typically used at a single location during its service life. The key here is it's not directly connected to a building service or distribution. So it can be plugged in with like a 110 outlet, but it can't be hardwired or otherwise hard connected with utilities. Temporary equipment, as I mentioned, means fixed, movable, or countertop or other equipment that is used during replacement, maintenance, or repair for a time of service as defined in Section 108. We also did have a new pin 68, that addresses all of these items and shows you all the anchorage requirements for them. There is a webinar that we did a couple months ago on that, and it is available. The video is available to watch that if you want more information on these types of equipment and their anchorage. We're just showing you what's changed in the code and kind of defining what these are, but as far as looking at the actual anchorage, I would recommend you review pin 68 or go back and look at the video that we have on our webinar page on our OSHPD website. Okay, for the definition of hand washing fixture, it's been clarified that it's a lavatory, which is a difference between a lavatory and a sink, because a lavatory is what you use for washing your hands or your face. A sink is for pots or pans or other type of utensils. A lavatory provided in patient rooms, nurse stations, or other patient care areas intended for staff hygiene and infection control. These are special use lavatories and are an element of a hand washing station. And we'll have a revised definition for hand washing station as well. And is subject to the requirements of the plumbing code. So basically a hand washing fixture is also intended to be accessible. Restricted areas, we removed 1R. Just for clarification, 1R is a type, a building type. When a building is removed from acute care service, it becomes a 1R. The OSHPD 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are actually based on the occupants that are within the building. So that's why 1R really doesn't apply to things like such as restricted areas or equipment anchorage, because those requirements are based on the occupancy, not the building type. So you'll see a lot of corrections with 1R throughout this. Minimum ceiling heights. Again, we removed 1R from that because ceiling heights are based on occupancy, not the building type, as well as the finished materials in a building. Again, they're going to be based on the occupancy. We also removed OSHPD 1R from the hospital banner because it's no longer a hospital once it becomes 1R. Another important change, I think, is the definition of change in function. It used to be satisfied the functional space requirements under a different code, and we removed the word space. Because what a change in function, what we want required is that the functional requirements be met if there's a change in function, not the space requirements. So in theory, you can have a patient room that's still a patient room for a different type of occupant, peds to adult or something, and the space shouldn't matter. The size of it does not need to be changed, but the functional requirements still need to be met. Still under definitions, we're going to hand washing station is basically a clinical staff use area. It provides hand washing fixture, cleaning agents, and means for drying hands. So basically a station has the sink or the lav, the cleaning soap and the paper towels, whatever. The whole unit is considered a station. Hand washing stations shall be immediately accessible to the patient care area they serve without requiring passage through a doorway unless hands-free operation is provided. You'll see this a lot with nourishment rooms or nourishment areas. Either one's required, but if you have a door, you need 2 sinks in that nourishment room. If it is open to the corridor and there's a hand washing fixture outside of that, nourishment area, you only need the one utility sink inside the nourishment area. Patient care locations has been defined period. Multi-patient treatment rooms, where allowed, may provide patient care stations in bays or cubicles as follows. A bay is a space for human occupancy with one hard wall at the head wall and up to one hard wall at either side with 2 or 3 soft walls. The reason this weird language is being added because we have one hard wall, and if you have a bed or a gurney at the end of a row and you happen to have a side wall and a head wall, that doesn't make it not a patient bay anymore. It's still part of the bay, but it didn't meet the requirement of only one wall at the head. So we did add this language because we do get those comments all the time. So that'll help clarify this. The required area for specific patient care space shall be provided within the cubicle curtain and not overlap with access circulation aisles. So if there is a required access aisle outside the cubicle curtain, that space cannot overlap with that. So if you have 3 feet at the sides of the bed, that's where your cubicle curtain will be. A cubicle remained the same. It's basically you have 3 walls and an open area at the foot of the bed. And then patient care station remains the same, and this is just basically where you have a bed for patient care. And we just added some language that a patient bedroom may be a patient room or a patient bedroom. Both terms are used throughout the building code. Corridor width for outpatient services, we're just pointing you back to section 1020.2 for the different widths of corridors and outpatients rather than addressing them in 1224 for outpatient services of a hospital. The same widths apply in section 1020. So there's no need to add more here, add more confusion. Ceiling heights. If you have a soffit, our ceiling heights in hospitals are 8 feet. If you have the exception for that is closets, toilet rooms, and bathroom ceiling heights. We're also adding soffits over fixed cabinets or workstations. This is like if you have a nurse station, you want to drop the soffit down over the nurse station to 7 feet, that would be allowed. So this adds some clarity to that. Grab bars for non-accessible patient rooms. All patient rooms have to have grab bars, but if you have a non-accessible patient rooms, it also has to have a grab bar, and we're clarifying that it has to meet the section 609(2), 3, 5, 6, and 8, which are listed here in purple for reference. Basically, we're eliminating the need that grab bar be horizontal. As you can see in the picture, this is where you can have the angled or even vertical type grab bars in a non-accessible patient room. This is allowing for CT rooms that you can have a control room or an alcove. This would be considered an alcove. You have no door separating the tech area from the service area. So that added some confusion where people were interpreting that as a door being required, and that is not the case for CT. We also changed word convenient. We've been trying to get rid of that word. We're making the toilet room for a CT readily accessible, which means located in the same department or service space as the identified area room, or located in and shared with an adjacent directly accessible unit. So that makes this a lot easier requirement to be met for CT scanners. Probably get 2 clicks here. Caesar, can you forward it? Oh, there it goes. Okay, storage, basically all this is saying is that storage that's in excess of what's required by the building code in 1224 can be located in a 1R building or a non-conforming building, but it has to be in excess of what's actually required for basic services. For NICU, we made some clarifications. Before it pointed us back to 1224-19, or 29, excuse me, for ICU. And so we had this requirement that NICUs had all the requirements, and ICU, I'm not sure what's going on here. This thing's jumping around on me, I apologize. A NICU had all the requirements of a ICU, which is not the intent. I'm trying to, if I hit this too many times, it jumps too far, so bear with me. So what we're adding here is changing the language to for requirements for a NICU bed to be specific to the NICU and not point back to the ICU as much. And this would be one of the requirements here is if you have multi-bay NICU beds, like a pod of 5 beds, you must still provide you must also provide a treatment room for private treatment of the baby or the patient. In addition to that, I'm going by memory here because this thing's not moving very fast. It also pointed back and required a nourishment area. A NICU does not require a nourishment area. It does require infant formula area. So the nourishment area has been eliminated as a requirement. It still points back by saying nourishment area is not required under this for a NICU. For emergency departments, in a trauma/cardiac room that is required for a basic service medical emergency department, if there's always been this requirement that scrub sinks be required at the entrance to the trauma rooms. A lot of facilities want to put hand washing stations inside because these can potentially be used as operating rooms under emergency conditions, that there is some controversy if the hand washing station would be allowed. And conferring with CDPH on this, it is allowed, but it needs to be 5 feet away from the procedure table, because that is the area that's most restrictive. So if there's a hand wash sink, like in this case, it's in the back here, needs to be 5 feet clear from the procedure table and not located between the curtains. If the bay is separated into 2 areas with a cubicle curtain, it has to be accessible from both bays. So it can't be contained in any one bay, or it needs to be in both if you're going to go that route. For in emergency rooms, there is a requirement in Title 22 that there is a medication preparation room. That language was removed from the code a couple cycles ago, and wasn't really an issue because a lot of emergency departments do include med rooms, but we have had circumstance where the med rooms were not included, and when the CDPH went out to survey to open the unit, they're looking for the med room. So we've added the language back in to match Title 22 that a med room shall be provided in accordance with 1224.4.4.4.1, which is the med room requirement. Just as a note, emergency departments are required to have at least 1 med room, and then they can have Pyxis or Omnicell type medical dispensing units throughout, but they need to have at least a minimum of 1 med prep room. for security purposes. For Nuke Med, we receive a lot of AMC's alternate methods of compliance requests to remove the dosing and the holding areas for patients because they're stating that they're not giving these patients any radioactive type doses, that there's no need for them to be secured or monitored from other patients. So we're adding an allowance here that the physicist report shall address any dosing or circulation of dosed patients in the nuclear med department, and that will better allow for the elimination of the holding and dosing areas in these rooms. We've also added that if there's multi-bay scanner rooms, a minimum clearance of 4 feet shall be provided between the scanner and any mobile screen used between bays. And we removed the requirement for full direct view of the patient. You still must have full view. There was just some confusion on if that meant looking down the bore of the equipment, and it does not. You just need to be able to see the patient when they're on the imaging equipment. There was a lot of confusion with the support areas for nuclear med. It used to say when operated separately from an image department, you have to provide the following. But if it was, and that's where your dosing area and your holding area came in. But if people were putting it as part of an imaging department, they said, we don't need that dosing area and we don't need that holding area. And the reality is you may, depending on the type of procedures going in. So this allows, with the top item here for dosing and circulation, this allows for the removal of those areas if they're not needed, but also makes it clear that if nuclear medicine is providing within the imaging department, compatible areas may be shared with the other modalities. But you still need that dosing area and the patient holding area for nuclear med if there's any type of the higher radiation doses are being administered. So hopefully I add some clarification on that in the future because it was worded poorly. Rehab therapy departments. When you look at rehab therapy, you have physical therapy, occupational therapy, and audio and speech pathology services. When 2 or more of these services are provided, they can be shared. That wasn't clear before, and a lot of times it was required to have a separate physical therapy department. Occupational therapy has separate units or separate little departments, and that is not the case. They can be shared. They can share the space. They can share the toilet between them. So this will, again, help add some clarification to that. And also, we made it clear that a lot of rehab hospitals do not have outpatient services, but it was always required that a outpatient, an exam room needed to be provided as well as an office for an outpatient physician. Now it says if outpatient rehab services are provided, then you have to require that waiting room and that exam room and office. Okay, the only requirement is that outpatients shall not traverse an inpatient nursing unit. For renal dialysis, we're just adding the requirement for a med station. And that can be either a med prep room or a self-dispense medication dispensing unit. Outpatient services for GI endoscopy rooms, just to align with FGI standards, we added the requirement for an eye wash station. I think each cycle we do, we try to get more in alignment with what the FGI is doing. For now, we're jumping over to skilled nursing. We're already done with hospitals. Skilled nursing facilities, intermediate care facilities must have a toilet room attached to each patient room. outpatient clinical services of a hospital. We're just, again, just changing the language to be a little more standard for consideration of a freestanding building that is outpatient can still be a licensed service of the hospital. Just referring you back to the Administrative Code Section 111, and also the Part 10 as the existing building code is Section 309A.5.1, basically covers what to do when you're changing a building from removing acute care services and want to keep it under the jurisdiction of OSHPD. Continuing with that, outpatient clinical service of the hospital provided in a freestanding building are regulated as OSHPD 3 and not OSHPD 1. Again, the acute care services most likely have been removed from that building. That's why it is a freestanding building now, outpatient building, and it goes by the occupancy, and the occupancy should be OSHPD 3 at this point. And then the services shall comply with 1226, which is your clinical requirements. Outpatient clinical services of a hospital that are addressed in provisions 1226 shall comply with the applicable provisions of 1224 and or 1228, as if those provisions were repeated in 1226.5. So basically, they're trying to better align the requirements for different departments, no matter if it's outpatient or a hospital service or a clinic. GI endoscopy, this is just being removed. It was redundant. It aligned. There's already a requirement for a soil utility room, so we removed the cleanup room. Jumping over to 1228 for psychiatric units. We are clarifying that for airborne isolation rooms, bedpan flushing attachments are not required, as they are considered anti-ligature safety issues. This has already been removed from patient rooms, and it was just removing them from the airborne isolation rooms. And I notice I'm showing the wand here versus the one on the toilet. Different reasons for that is that the toilet mount one can conflict with accessible rooms, but the one with the hose can actually be removed from the wall. Just changing some of the language from unit to service space for psychiatric facilities. And also noting that a pediatric and adolescent activity space may be centralized for common use by multiple pediatric and adolescent units, or maybe in individual units. The patient risk assessment, safety risk assessment that you do as part of the functional program will identify the different risks and if they can be shared. This is a scheduling thing and not a building code thing, but we can provide areas for activity that can be shared between the different populations, but not at the same time. And they cannot traverse any adult patient populations when they're traveling.
All right, thanks, Richard, for that. That's a lot of good information. I want to take this opportunity to remind everyone that if you have a project-specific question, please go ahead and send it to the regs unit at oshpod.ca.gov email. That's regsunit@oshpd.ca.gov. So next for a presenter, we have Mr. Roy Lobo, Principal Structural Engineer. Roy, I'm going to go ahead and if you don't mind, help you with the transitioning of the slides here. So please let me know when you're ready to advance the slides. Roy?
Okay, thank you, Cesar, and thanks everyone for listening to this webinar on structural changes to the Part 2, Volume 2 of the 2019 mid-cycle. So what we have here are basically changes in the structural chapters. So this is only limited changes. So we have changes to Chapter 16, 16A. Those are related to anchorage and bracing of equipment. Chapter 17, we have some changes for special inspection for architectural components related to periodic inspections, and then changes related to special seismic certifications. Chapter 18, Soils and Foundations, we have changes, basically a very small, very minor change to coordinate with changes that were initiated by DSA. Masonry, these were changes that we made when we made the OSHPD 1R categories, and we transferred the requirements from the A chapters for OSHPD 2 and OSHPD 5 to model code. So when we did that, we transferred our amendments from the A chapters to the non-A chapters for chapter 21. And with that, we initiated a number of public comments related to masonry. So we basically cleaned up the language to address those public comments. Chapters 22 and 22A are related to steel. This is where we adopted the AISC 358, Supplement 1, Chapter 11, that is to include the use of bolted side plate connections, and Appendix L, earthquake recording instrumentation. This is required to maintenance of that, and who pays for that. Next slide, Caesar. Okay, so coming down to each specific code change, I'll go through them fairly quickly. So in this section, basically, it's related to the component importance factors. So when we made the change, we made a change. It's for I sub p equals 1.5 for certain components in the non-A chapters of model code, and in that the way it was originally written was a little bit overbroad, and it says medical and electrical components and components required for life support for patients. So then we clarify the language that is only that I sub p is equal to 1.5. These are the requirements in the model code requirements. We didn't want everything to have an I sub p of 1.5, and then that also brings with it maybe requirements for special seismic certification. So we eliminated that. We clarified the language there. Next slide. Yeah. So in order to do that, so this is related to the exemptions and exceptions for equipment. So the so what happens here is that section 1617A.1.18 modified requirements of ASC 7 section 13.1.4, which is exceptions to anchorage and bracing of non-structural components. So since we had our own definitions, initially we were co-aligned with DSA, so we made our own section. Next slide. So these are the changes that were made. Richard already talked about all the definitions for fixed, movable, mobile equipment, etc. So what we have in this particular section is given the definition. So once you classify your equipment into which category it's going to be, then the specific requirement for anchorage and bracing is given in this particular section. So the reason why we did this was because the original way in which it was written was we had exceptions from anchorage and bracing, then we had exemptions to the exceptions, and it was getting a little bit confusing. So we decided to write it more in the affirmative, like these equipment will be anchored and braced. So you start with fixed, then you move on to is it fixed? No, you move to movable, mobile, etc. And then you can see whether you had to be anchored and braced and what the requirements for. And if you want to have more information on that, there is a pin 68 that you can refer to, and I think Richard also mentioned about that as well. Next slide. So if you look at pin 68, there's a nice graphics there that once you classify your equipment into whether it's going to be fixed, it's going to be countertop, or it's other, then you look at what the weight of that equipment is and where the CG is. And then based on that, you will know whether you have to anchor it, whether it's exempt, or whether you have to anchor it and give us calculations, or you don't have to give us calculations. So for example, if you look at the top figure on the left, it says fixed or movable equipment. So then it says, then if your equipment is below 4 feet, if the center of gravity of that equipment is below 4 feet, then you only need to anchor and brace that equipment. If the center of gravity of the equipment is above 4 feet, and weight is less than 400 pounds, right? And then if your weight is less than 400 pounds and your center of mass is above 4 feet, then you need to also provide supporting calculations. So like that, you can move through each of those figures depending on, once you decide what classification your equipment is, you will need to know, then you will know whether it's exempt or whether it's to be anchored and what are the requirements for that. So I recommend everybody look at pin 68 if you're not clear on what needs to be anchored and braced. Next. Yeah, so this was kind of a cleanup for the provisions for piping and tubing systems. So this was an exception that we have for distributed systems that are sitting on a trapeze. So the way that if you have from bracing those trapezes, if the trapeze assembly and whatever distribution system is sitting on that has certain limitations on rod size, diameter, etc. And then these are all exceptions in the A chapters. And then it says, do not support IP with piping with an I sub P greater than 1.0. So since it's already the A chapters, your I sub P was already 1.5, and this I sub P greater than 1.0 was causing kind of a confusion, and that was not the intent. So we deleted that sentence there, or those statements there, so that we said do not support piping with I sub P greater than 1. We deleted that so that we avoid any confusion in how you adopt the exemption from piping and bracing when you have certain criteria that is met. Next. So this is the change that we made for architectural components, which says periodic inspection is required. So we said that, and then with that, it also brought in requirements for verified reports and special inspectors required. And we said for some of these things, we have continuous inspection. So we said if you already have continuous inspection with an IOR performing that duty, then you don't need to have a periodic special inspection done on top of that, right? So if that work is already being performed by IOR doing continuous inspection, why do we need another periodic special inspector to do that same work? So we said an exception to that. We said it's not required if it is performed, the work is performed in accordance with section 7-145 of the California Administrative Code. So we just cleaned up the language there. Next slide. Yeah, and this change was regarding special seismic certification for fluoroscopy, X-ray, and CT equipment, and then also a change for servers and routers. So go to the next slide. So what happened here was there was a comment by MITA, so which said that you have an exception for CT on the item 8 is struck out here. You have an exception for CT. So CT equipment used for treatment in hybrid operating rooms, including those for interventional CT, unless used for diagnostic assessment of trauma injuries. But you do not have the same exception for fluoroscopy and X-ray equipment, and they are all, to do the same thing for treatment of trauma injuries. And they said that, so it looks like only CT is exempt, but if it is put in one of these rooms and for those purposes, but that exemption is not applied for fluoroscopy and X-ray equipment. So so then we had a discussion on that, and then we decided that we're going to say it's going to be imaging equipment, which is fluoroscopy, CT, X-ray, etc. So which is required for emergency treatment of trauma patients, shall be special seismic certified. So those are equipment that needs to be tested on a shake table test. And they said, but we want to limit the number of those that are required. So if, for example, you are a trauma facility and you need a number of these equipment, then you need to certify all of those. That is going to basically treat people that are going to be coming in for trauma in an emergency, especially like an earthquake. So if you want to be able to make sure all of those are special seismic certified, and then it also says a minimum of one. So minimum of one. So basically, the hospital gets to decide which of those imaging equipment used for trauma, for treatment of trauma injuries, is required to be functional after an event. So that's the thing, but we said a minimum of one of those has to be there. Next slide. Yeah, and then the other change for special seismic certifying was made for servers and routers and also switches, because now a lot of the hospital functions are now being controlled by computers. Your doors, your lights, operating tables, a lot of these are computer controlled, and these are dependent on your servers, routers, and medical data, etc., and a lot of encryption stored. So if any of those go down, you may not be able to perform the function that you're expected to perform. And so we need to be fully functional in the event of an earthquake. So we said that all those servers, routers, and switches that are required for the continued operation of the facility need to be shake table tested. Now, we made some also modifications to that. We said some of these are already shake table tested as part of the quality control. So the vendor says, you know what, these servers, routers, etc., are so critical. They have a lot of tests going on for those. He said we will permit those without doing additional shake table testing if the seismic test for those particular servers, routers, and switches conformed, were at a level that where you're going to install it, that exceeded that acceleration demand, and it still was functional, then we will not require additional shake table testing for those. So we made changes there, and then with the introduction of the new equipment categories, we also introduced terms like temporary and interim. So we said those equipment also, even though they may have typically required special seismic certification, now do not require special seismic certification. So we clarified that. Next slide. Yeah, so pier and curtain wall foundations, currently they were just reserved, and now DSA said we want to say not permitted, so OSHPD said fine. Next. Yeah, so these are amendments that I spoke about earlier in the masonry chapter. These were to align with, were basically in response to public comments made for the 2018 triennial code cycle change that we made. So we got public comments from there, and one of the agreements was that we will make those changes in the mid-cycle. So I'll just walk you quickly through each of those changes. Next slide. So yeah, so the first change was in section 2103.5A, entrainment. So we had initially the language said entraining substances. So the comment was that's vague. There's no term like substances, so we changed it to materials or entraining admixtures. Next. Very minor changes. Next slide. Yeah, the next one was on section 2104.2.1. This was related to grout pose. So instead of specifying what needs to be done, we just referred to the TMS section that basically has similar language for that same purpose. And then there was another statement which said the construction document shall completely describe the grouting procedures subject to approval by OSHPD. And then the public comment found that is kind of unenforceable, so we agreed with that and we deleted that statement from the language. Next. Yeah. So this is section 2105.2 compressive strength. So we said specified compressive strength F prime M assumed in design. So they did not like the word assumed, right? And so typically right now, if you build something with masonry, the minimum compressive strength is around 2000 psi. So we said that. So since that's the case, we said the minimum compressive specified compressive strength in the design shall be 2000 psi. So we just clarify the language to remove the word assumed from the existing language. And then there was an exception subject to approval of the enforcement agencies. So we felt that's not appropriate language, because then that gives too much leeway to the enforcement agency to decide, oh, we're not going to accept this, or we're going to accept this. So this is related to higher F prime M. So we said we deleted that that sentence there, that those words, and we said higher values of F prime M may be used in the design of reinforced grouted masonry. We removed the approval by the enforcement agencies. And then there was another sentence we removed, was related to the strength and stiffness. The design shall take into account motor depth. So those also we felt were unenforceable and cannot be calculated. So we removed that language as well. Next. Again, in this section, there was a reference to TMS 402 section 4.4.4.2.2, which was pointed out was an inappropriate reference. So we deleted that. Next. Yeah, so this is the minimum reinforcement for masonry columns. So, and then it says the spacing of column ties shall not be greater than 8 bar diameters, 28 tie diameters, or 1/2 the dimension of the columns, or the full height of the column. And the comment was that there is a limit on the maximum spacing of ties to 8 inches, and column dimensions can be such that you can exceed that 8 inches, and that will be incompatible with what the code requirements are. So we said, okay, we will say or 8 inches, and we remove the 28 tie diameter requirement from there, because it's already 3/8 inch, so it was redundant. So next. Yeah, and this was related to maximum bar size, 2107.4. So initially we had your bar size cannot be greater than number 9, and then there was a comment about that, because there is now actually a conflict between what the allowable stress design section of TMS says and the strength design section of what TMS says. The strength design still limits your maximum bar size for I'm talking about the 2016 code, TMS 2016, so we just said we'll reference the appropriate section of TMS 404 9.3.3.1, which limits the bar size to number 9. That of course is going to be changing in the upcoming code, but OSHPD still intends to keep this minimum requirement of maximum bar diameter or limited to number 9 for future. So that may change back to our requirement in a future code cycle. And then section 2107.6, it says masonry components that are subject to in-plane forces. So the public comment was, oh, this is not clear. what components mean. So then we clarified what those are and what that specific code section referred to in terms of the requirements for that section. Okay, next. Okay, and then we're moving on to steel, chapter 22 and chapter 22A. We had a lot of conversations with SitePlate, and we also approved some of their design criteria, and then we were starting to find a lot of alternate method of compliance for use of bolted connections, for SitePlate bolted connections, which was currently not there in the building code. And so, but it was already there, that language for which was approved by the IIC 358-16 in supplement 1, chapter 11. It was already approved by the PRP for this connection. And so we said, okay, we've gone through the design criteria for this, we made amendments, we are using it on certain projects. So we said, okay, we will include this particular connection. It's a pre-qualified Bowman connection for use for OSHPD projects, provided that they follow our design criteria. So we came up with some limitations on the use of that, and then we had discussions with SitePlate, and then we came to an agreement that everyone is comfortable that for OSHPD projects, they will permit it to use these bolted connections as opposed to the welded connections, and given that people follow those additional requirements in the design criteria. Next slide. Next. Yeah. So this is basically the historic loop. The figures on the left show the historic loop for welded connection. The figures on the right show them for a bolted. So while the bolted can show that it can do plastic deformations, you know, exceeding that of a welded connection, if you can see, there's some slip at some midway in the demand, in the moment capacity, you know, it slips and then picks up strength after that to reach its full moment capacity of the beam. So so that's how they're able to get like further out on the plastic rotation curve. However, when it comes to things like wind, you know, we want to meet within a certain range. So we said, okay, for events that do not push, are supposed to be elastic, that do not push your deformation into the inelastic range or for a required R factor, then for those cases, we will limit your MP to a fraction of what your moment capacity of a beam is for wind design, but for earthquakes, we will permit you your full. So looking at all those, we came up with the design criteria. Can you go to the next slide? So we came up with some design criteria for that. So these are the requirements that if you want to use the bolted side plate connection, it is advantageous to use this compared to the welded side plate connection because it saves a lot of, it's cheaper, I think, and it saves a lot of inspection requirements and welding, because the welding for those side plate connections was causing a lot of problems. There's a lot of inspection to be done, and it's pretty expensive. And if something goes wrong, you know, that to redo those and make and fix those weld problems was an issue. So so side plate is now trying to have a combination of welded in the shop and then field bolted in the field. So so the setup is a lot easier and it's a lot faster and easier to construct. So next slide. Yeah, so this is regarding maintenance for buildings that require seismic instrumentation. So there are two types of seismic instrumentation that is required. So one is OSHPD paid instrumentation for buildings, and one is owner paid. So if depending on your building, if it requires an AMC, an alternate method of compliance for your structural lateral force system, then you are required to instrument the building. So if it is required instrumentation for that specific lateral force resisting system for that particular hospital building, then the original language was said that OSHPD picks up the maintenance tab for that. So we said, no, well, we are only going to pick up the data retrieval and instrument and processing of and records will be the responsible enforcing agencies. If something goes wrong with the instrumentation or the seismic accelerometer or the recorder, then that will be the responsibility of the owner. So then we contract this with CSMIP, so then we will be sending the owner a bill for that. So we will let them know, hey, this instrumentation is not working, and then they need to fix it. So either they fix it or they can have CSMIP fix it for them, and then they will get billed for that. Okay, okay, I'm done.
Great, thank you, Roy, for that. That's a lot of good information. Again, we want to thank everybody who has taken the time to type in a question into the go-to question box. So we'll go ahead and go over those here in just a minute. But I also want to remind you that you can have an answer to a specific project-related question by emailing us at that email that we shared with you before, which is regsunit@oshpa.ca.gov. So Richard and Roy, now we're getting into the question and answer portion of our presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and read out these questions. So if you can, please provide an answer to those. So Richard, this first question is for you. Does maintenance include replacing a motor if it dies?
Yeah, if it's a subcomponent, yes, you can replace a motor. That's not a big deal. They have to be replaced in kind. It's when they replace the entire unit that they would need to notify us and do a equipment replacement project. So replacing a motor or a fan or something like that on a piece of equipment is definitely maintenance.
Great, thank you. Next question is for you as well, Richard. The question reads, can you describe an example of major scope change?
No, I cannot. There's too many variables. What we're looking at avoiding here is when you say design an emergency department and you have everything laid out, it gets reviewed, it's maybe first, second, third back check, and it comes back in and they revise the whole thing. Where basically if we have to go back and do our review over, that's what we're trying to trigger this requirement for, because the reality is that even if it happens now, the way the code's currently written, it's supposed to be canceled and resubmitted as a new project. But we don't do that. Actually, typically, we eat the cost and re-review it, and as well as the same thing with the ACDs. If a major change comes in, typically we redo it or we get permission from the owner to do his time and materials. What we're trying to avoid is the re-review of the project. If you're doing a change, no problem. But if you're saying, okay, we're going to take this space, disregard everything that we've done, and now here's our new design that goes in there, that would what I would consider a major change. But as far as defining that, as far as cost or space, that can't be done. It's going to be a case-by-case basis. And if there's justification for it, true justification, rather than someone change their mind, you may be fine.
Great, thank you, Richard. And this next question, I believe you sort of answered it already, but I'll read it off anyways in case you'd like to add anything to your response. The question reads, Section 7-153, changes to approved work. Major changes is not referenced in the code language. What extent of change, quote unquote, requires a new project application? Would it be helpful to describe the extent of change?
Yeah, it's like same thing. It's just impossible to trigger that with a definition, because you can have a small project that you come in and revise the whole thing, even though the quantity may be small. But again, the review has been done, the process, the effort has been exerted to complete that. And it comes back in and we got to start from scratch. Again, on a small project, it may not be that big, but now you have a big project. Again, how do you define what would be considered a major change? Typically what I've been seeing is they will go back to the design team and the owner and say, to make this change, we want to submit it as an examination, which is time and materials. And if the owner says fine, we proceed accordingly. But it's usually something pretty substantial that would trigger that.
If Richard, this one's for you as well, and it's kind of a project-specific question, but we'll ask it. It might help others. I currently have a network cable installation that is close to completion, and the hospital is planning to add wireless access points throughout the campus to augment the network. Would the wireless AP network scope addition to the network cable install be reviewed and inspected on T&M basis, or would it have to be a separate project?
That's a good question, because we see a lot of this. The intent of these projects when they come in to do a network or even run conduit as a project, the intent is to come in with another project to address the specific components that are being attached to that network. So that would be a separate project. If they went in and wanted to do a ACD to add the other components, again, that's going to be up to the design review team, or the review team, I should say, to make that clear, if they would consider that as an ACD. But most of these projects that we see come in this way, the intent is just to get the infrastructure installed, and then they come in later with another project to add the components. We see that quite often. It's never really been an issue, and we've never, that I know of, had them add the components midstream and say, okay, now we want to add these. Because that can easily be done as a separate project simultaneously with the review and not affect the current review. That's how I would address it.
That's great, and we hope that helps, Dean. Richard, for you, next question is regarding C-arm. Is a C-arm considered mobile equipment?
Depends. Is it anchored to the ceiling? Some C-arms would be considered mobile. Depends if it falls under the definition of mobile or movable. That's what we'd be looking at. You do have some C-arms that you can move around from room to room. That would be truly mobile. If it's in the one imaging room and is positioned in the same position every day for use and is on occasion moved out for cleaning, that would be movable.
All right, thank you for that, Richard. As it relates to essential equipment, the person asking the question says, please confirm essential equipment, quote unquote, is its own definition. Doesn't matter if it's countertop, fixed, interim, mobile, movable, or other temporary. Only non-essential equipment should be designated as countertop, movable, etc., right?
Well, essential is going to be anchored, period. And that's where it comes in. And Roy, you can add to this if you want. But essential is identified by the owner during the plan design as an essential equipment. But essential equipment also considers anything required for basic services. So that's what, I mean, there's been a ton of discussion on the definition of essential, and it's gone round and round, and it's settled on this. Basically, the owner identifies it during the design phase and it would need to be anchored. If it's needed in the case of an emergency, if it's going to be used, if there's an event, it's considered essential and should be anchored. And yes, it can fall across all the different categories of fixed, movable, countertop. Roy, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think there may be a weight limit on that. You know, I mean, it may be anchored above a certain weight in CG or something. It may have some exceptions, but generally you're right.
Yeah, thank you. I would really recommend you guys watch the Pin 68. It's really, it's an hour of just this equipment anchorage stuff. It's actually Ali Sumer did it. It's very good. It answers a lot of questions. We do get a lot of questions on this whenever we discuss it.
Great, thank you. Thank you both, Roy and Richard. Next question, Richard, I believe this one is for you. The question reads, in the area of a bay needs to be within the cubicle curtain, how do we handle the space between bays where 3 foot clear is required to the side of the gurney or 5 foot between gurneys? Does this new definition require a minimum of 6 feet now between gurneys, or would the curtain be 2.5 feet from the gurneys?
No, the 3 foot, if it says 3 feet between beds, that's your requirement. If it says 5 feet between beds, that's your requirement. That would put the cubicle curtain at 18 inches or even at 2.5 feet. What the language says, it does not overlap with the access circulation aisle. So that's kind of, it's really not between the beds they're concerned about, but more at the foot of the bed, and the access circulation is not obstructed. That does come up a lot, and we are re-looking at this to make sure it is clear. But even from an accessibility standpoint, you have 3 feet clear at the side of the bed, but the cubicle curtain can still be 2.5 feet because it is a non-fixed obstruction. So that's a good question, and like I said, we continue to look at this language on that. They have considered going to 6 feet, but that would really throw off a lot of projects, especially in the future when people do redesign.
As it relates to definitions, quote, hand washing station, unless hands-free operation is provided, should it be clarified to hands-free operation of door, quote unquote, rather than hands-free operation of associated hand washing station component?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, yes, you're correct. And it is very confusing. I went back and read it, and I think adding the hands-free operation of the door is what's intended and will be clarified in the future. Basically what it says is hand washing stations shall be immediately accessible to the patient care area they serve without requiring passage through a doorway unless hands-free operation is provided. It's hands-free operation of the door is provided. So you're not touching a doorknob or pushing on a door. That's what's important there. So that's a good catch.
That's great. How are the infection control issues of a drain in a room used for open invasive procedures dealt with?
I'm assuming this is referring to the hand washing sink in the trauma room that can be used as a OR, and ORs are not allowed to have sinks. We have met with CDPH and we have consulted with others to get this definition, and that's where the 5 foot around the table came in as a requirement, as a minimum requirement. The answer we got was that these rooms are typically used more for the trauma patient, not necessarily as an OR, and on the rare occasion they are used as an OR, that this would be acceptable. So that's the best answer I can give you. But we did run this through CDPH.
Great, thank you, Richard. Richard, regarding clinics, do the section 1224 requirements that are applicable to hospital outpatient services also applicable to OSHPD 3 clinics that are not hospital outpatient services, such as community clinics, etc.?
Only if the OSHPD 3 requirements point them back to 1224. Otherwise, they have their own requirements in 1226. We are adding some language in the next cycle to help clarify that. And basically it says if, I believe it says that in here is too, if they are repeated, you go with the section they belong to. Otherwise, they point back to 1224, 1228, and they should be treated as such. Where we're seeing big differences in it, like dialysis, those are specific to the types of clinics or the inpatient or outpatient of a hospital requirements. So they do specify when they point back and when they do not. If they don't, they usually have their own requirements within 1226, and that's where the OSHPD 3. I don't know if I just confused that or if it helped.
Well, and if those have more questions on that specific topic, please email us at regsunit@oshpod.ca.gov. Roy, this next question I believe is for you. Do the PIN 68 criteria for under 4 feet, no calcs, apply to wall-supported equipment?
No. That we're going to make that change in the next cycle. So we're going to clarify that requirement.
Yeah, we get that question a lot. Wall is still 20 pounds anywhere on the wall. Has nothing to do with height.
Great, thank you. Next question. For seismic certification for routers and switches, is there an exception if their weights are below a certain amount? These are typically very light without much load.
See, the thing is, these are put in racks and things, and generally, we do not have an exception for those. So they may need to be considered on a case-by-case basis, but they're typically not. There's no exception. We have exception for under 50 pounds, but those are surface mounted. These are in racks. It's not exactly surface mounted, and typically they need to be shake table tested with the rack. However, we've given some exceptions, like, okay, if a rack is strong enough, robust enough, then only the server or router or switch needs to be shake table tested. But currently, there is no exception on weight for those. But we did clarify if it is affecting the operation of the hospital. So if we can show that it's not, or you have a redundant system or whatever, we may look into that and decide on whether it needs seismic certification or not.
All right, and in terms of roof equipment, if OSHPD has approved the design, in this individual's case, for screening mechanical equipment, does the city or county need to approve also? We are a county facility.
If it's a new roof screen, the city or the local jurisdiction would have to approve that. Basically, if it's aesthetic, they'd have to approve it. Now, if it's replacing an existing one, they don't necessarily have to. But if they're adding something new, like a new HVAC unit, and they're putting a roof screen around it, that we would ask for local approval of that, and it's usually at the planning level.
That's great. Next question is, and Roy, this question might be for you. Does the inspector have to go to the factory to review the side plate welding portion, or is this routinely done by OSHPD staff?
No, there's a special welding inspector. He needs to have the proper qualifications to do that welding inspection, and he's going to be the one doing that. We only do observation. We do not do inspection.
Perfect. And the next question has to do with scheduling and invoices. So the question reads, please clarify who schedules the maintenance of seismic instrumentation? Is it OSHPD and then they send invoice to owner, or is it the owner supposed to schedule
it? That's a new requirement. So far, we've not had anyone, have the owner schedule it and things like that. That's still in process. But what happens is, if the CSMIP tells us that, hey, this particular hospital, this instrumentation is not working, then we will contact the owner and say, hey, listen, your equipment is not working. This is an hospital owner required instrumented building. Therefore, we have two options. One of them, you can fix it yourself. Once it's ready, then you can contact CSMIP to make sure that the data transmission is coming correctly. And or you can have CSMIP go ahead and fix it, and then we will invoice you. So that's how that's going to work.
Thank you, Roy. Richard, this question might be for you. The question reads, would changes to phasing in a project be considered major change? When is a determination to review as examination/T&M determined?
Well, my first answer was going to be no. But I've literally seen a project come in that was a change to phasing, which completely redesigned the entire mechanical system for the department. In that case, it would be yes, that would be a major change. If you're just changing like the sequence, things like that, because with mechanical is a big deal when it comes to phasing, because a lot of times you have to provide complete mechanical systems to the spaces that are already being serviced. And so it is going to be same answer as before. It's going to be a case-by-case basis when it's going to be looked at it. What is the extent of the change, both in phasing and how does it affect the design? Again, most of the projects we get in here, most of the changes that we see during review do not go to this level. But there are some that we've had serious meetings over the amount of changes that are being done, either mid-review or as an ACD to a project. And if the owner is insisting on these changes being made, a lot of times they're okay with doing a T&M review for that. And really the T&M is an option to keep it in the project and keep the process going versus submitting a separate project or a separate component of the work. So it's really, it is designed to help the process move faster, but also have OSHPD get compensated for duplication of their work, their effort.
Great. Thank you, Richard. That's a lot of good information, and we hope that you all in attendance are catching all this and taking notes. If not, please send us a follow-up email. Next question is, why are there different requirements for different imaging modalities? What regs apply to, quote, combination equipment such as a PET-CT?
In what regard are they asking, like for anchorage or for installation, for clearances?
Yeah, that's a very, very general question. So,
Yeah.
Robin, if you're there and you're still here in attendance, please send a follow-up or clarification in the go-to panel for that question. If you're there, if not, email us.
Yeah, as a general rule, like a PET-CT would fall under your nuclear med type situation, whereas a standard PT-CT would not. So there's a lot of variables to that question that it would be hard to answer generically.
Great. And maybe the next question, Richard, is for you. The question is a Pyxis unit essential?
If there's not an alternate method to receive the meds, yes. If power goes out and the Pyxis goes down, there has to be a way to get meds. That's why a Pyxis needs to be on a critical branch. So yes, for anchoring, they are required to be anchored. They are considered movable.
Next question is, would a nourishment refrigerator be considered essential?
Not necessarily. It depends if the owner classifies it as such.
Great.
And it may also depend on where it is, what department it's in. If it's a basic service department, like a med surg unit, it might, whereas in an ICU, that's optional. It may not be, but it also would depend on the size. There's a lot of factors that goes into that.
For this next question, Richard, and it has to do with part of the code that was clarified dealing with CT full view, quote unquote, in a control room. So the question reads, for CT full view from control room could still be interpreted as looking at the full body, like down the barrel. Does this mean you can have a partial direct view from control room and full view via camera?
No. Basically, full view means you need to see the patient if there's any distress. If anything's going wrong, you have to be able to see if that patient is in any danger. It does not mean down the barrel. An MRI does require a view down the barrel. Now, with a hybrid operating room where you have imaging modalities in there as well as an operating room, and the rooms are very long, we are allowing the use of a camera to monitor the patient status, but that's the only location the camera can be used. But otherwise, like a CT, you just want even a side view of the patient just to know if something's wrong. A lot of those do have cameras on them, but that is in addition to the physical site of the patient. But they have
Right.
they have cameras built into the bores where they can monitor the patient that way. But that's not in lieu of being able to see the patient.
This next question is a follow-up to the Pyxis question that you answered earlier, Richard. The question says, how about a half Pyxis which sits on a countertop which is 2 foot high? And that the original question was, is a Pyxis unit essential?
It's still the same answer. It's still essential. It's still required to give drugs to the patient, the meds to the patient.
Great.
So you would
and,
use
Rob,
1068 to determine the type of anchorage that would be required or how it's presented, but yes.
Great. And Robin was able to follow up on the clarification of the question. The original question is, why are there different requirements for different imaging modalities? To what regs apply to combination equipment such as a PET-CT? And Robin wrote back and said, anchorage is clear in terms of emergency use, and then also provided, well, what about clearances that apply to CTs? Would those apply to MRIs or PET-CTs?
The clearances, they have their own requirements. CTs, MRIs, they all have their own requirements. As far as the use of the equipment, Roy, you can answer that as far as the differences if you want, or I can give it a shot.
Give it a
for
shot.
Emergency use. Basically what we're doing, right now, the code requires a fluoroscopy room to be provided. That's because Title 22 requires it. So you have to have a fluoroscopy room. Currently, that fluoroscopy room is your essential go-to modality for imaging in the case of an event. What we're allowing, and Roy, correct me if I'm wrong, but what we're allowing is the facility to choose what modality. Is it CT? Is it the fluoroscopy unit? Is it the MRI? Whatever it might be. I don't think it's MRI. It's X-ray, fluoroscopy, or CT. They can pick which of those are used in the event of an emergency, and that piece of equipment would be the one that has to be seismically certified. Is that correct, Roy?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah. And then really the restriction we're getting is Title 22 hasn't been updated in quite a while. It's currently, they're redoing the imaging department right now, but the requirement for fluoroscopy has always been there and it's still there. But it doesn't mean that has to be what's used in the case of an event. So we're allowing that to change, but that piece of equipment that's selected to be used, and I find more facilities are going with the CT scanner to be used in an event, that would have to be the seismically certified component.
Correct.
And that's why there's a difference. It
Great,
doesn't get into PET CT and doesn't get into that. Those are different uses. You're limited to CT, X-ray, and fluoroscopy.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Roy, for answering all the questions that came in. We are not seeing any more questions come in the go-to panel, so we want to take this opportunity to thank you for participating in this presentation, both you, Richard, and Roy. And for those who signed up to attend this part one, we also want to thank you for your interest and want to remind you that on February 9th, we have part two of this 2019 CBSC, or California Building Standards Code, intervening code cycle updates. Part two is going to cover the California Electrical Code, the California Mechanical Code, the California Plumbing Code, and the California Existing Code. So if you have time, please make time or participate and join us for this presentation. And if you know someone who might benefit from this information, feel free to pass the word along, have them join us as well. We want to go ahead and thank you for joining us today. So until next time, thank you for being here, and thank you for doing your part in providing access to safe, quality healthcare environments. Until next time.